conversation that I don't know that what we were trying to, our objective of this wasn't about the assisted training materials. I think that would have to be a longer kind of segment.
It's about
So
time
we're
we
not
read
going to
one of
pull
those.
in Charlie for the Vicious Cycle for 3 minutes, I'm guessing. I don't know.
You might, just for bragg's sake.
Okay. Well, are there other topics we should add to this?
I mean, I'm wondering if it's okay if we just, as questions occur to us.
Yeah,
Sure,
we
absolutely.
ask them. There might be, I could think of some things that I might ask him to, in the book you talk about X, maybe then you just talk about it.
I talked about X in there?
What was the?
I don't even remember writing that.
It's triple X.
Triple X,
There you go.
So are you guys recording?
Yes, we are
ready?
recording. Now,
You started trying to let us
between-
go to ease. We're going to get ease in the sound.
Between each question and response, give us 2 seconds of
Quiet.
pause so that we can cut in those spaces. If you ask a question right on top of the finish of an answer, that can keep us from getting a good
Okay.
cut.
So who's first?
I will be first. Charlie, talk to us about Henry.
Talk to you about Henry. The first time I ever saw Henry was at the University of Chicago back in 1948. He'd already left that university. He was a guy who was almost like faculty to the faculty. I mean, his job, he taught some courses, but he was also a guy who was seen as kind of the thought leader for a lot of things that went on at the school at the time. And I saw him only from the back of his head. Somebody pointed over and they said, "That's Henry Wieman." And I was still in that stage of my life where I felt like, well, so what? I mean, I already know Henry has nothing to say. And what I discovered later was he was there to receive a professor emeritusship at the University of Chicago. And that's why they were honoring him, but it didn't even register on me at the time. So then there's this sort of gap between 1955 and the request for me to go over and offer his thought to a group of people who had gathered and wanted Henry to talk to him. And Henry at this time was probably 87 years old, and he was having some heart problems and energy problems, and he said, "I'd love to do it, but I don't feel like I have the strength or the energy or the capacity to both give a talk and then be really as sharp as I'd like to be for questions and answers." And so he said, "What I'd really appreciate is if you get someone who would give my ideas, and then I could respond to that person, and then I could go ahead then and deal with questions and answers from the audience." And at that time, there was a man that they had asked in Des Moines, where I was living at the time, if he would do it, and he said he would rather not, but he knew a guy who had been studying process philosophy and would be the guy to get. So they asked me, and I was at this time still an arrogant academic, and so when they said, "Would you be willing to do this?" I said, "Sure, no problem. I'd be glad to do that." And I sort of put it on the back burner until it was about 3 or 4 weeks before I was actually supposed to do this, when it sort of hit me like a ton of bricks what I had agreed to do, and that there was no way off the hook. I was going to have to go do this. So I was at that time was studying under a professor who himself had been an instructor under Dr. Wieman when he was at Chicago. So I ran to Frank Gardner, was his name, Frank Gardner, and I said, "Frank, what do I do? What do I read? How do I get my arms around this thing?" And he said, "Well, I would read Man's Ultimate Commitment and The Source of Human Good," which were 2 of Henry's books. And then he said there's a Zygon journal, which is of science and religion. And Henry had been part of the early group that had actually built that magazine from scratch, and that he'd written a couple of articles recently. He said, "That's the most recent thinking." So I said, "I'll do it." And so I read frantically for about 2 weeks, and then I went back to Frank with my outline. I said, "Frank, here's what I got. Does it make any sense? I mean, am I in the ballpark?" That's how little I knew about what I was doing. And he looked it over and he said, "Oh, I think that you're doing a fair assessment, a decent job." So I also agreed because we were going to have, I lived in Des Moines, and we were going to hold this meeting in Iowa City, and Henry was living halfway in between in Grinnell, where he was retired. So I said, let me pick him up and take him over, because hopefully I might be able to pick his brain while we're going over and get some insights that I may have missed. Well, somehow when he got in the car, before we got to Iowa City, he knew a great deal about me. He'd drawn me out and had me talking and all this sort of stuff. And I realized when I got there, I didn't know a bit more about Henry than when I started. And I thought that was not a wise move on my part. But the long and the short of it is, I think I talked for about 40 minutes about his thought. And that scene is so vivid to me that when he stood up from where he was, and I think he's probably 6'3" or so. He's a fairly tall gentleman. And he turned to the group and he said, Dr. Palmgren has just given you my thought better than I could have given it myself. And at that point, you could have, I mean, I was gone to another galaxy. It was like, I couldn't believe what he'd said. But the ride home was very different, and that was the beginning of a relationship that then went on in depth until his death in 1975. So this was 1976. And so we were together for part of that. Even though I moved to Georgia, I didn't spend all that time with him, but he was very much a part of my life from that moment on. So the other story I always loved to tell about Henry was I'd made arrangements for him at the school where I was working to give him an honorary doctorate. And I thought I was really doing him a favor, get him honorary doctorate. And after it was over, I found out it was his 6th one, so that it wasn't really that big a deal. But in the process of sitting the people up at the table during this ceremony, I was sitting right next to the podium because I was going to introduce Dr. Wieman and what he thought and so on. But my wife, Marion, was sitting next to him. And at that time in her life, my wife was not much for academics because she was married to sort of this arrogant kid who she kind of was turned off, in other words, by people who thought they were smart. And so she went to that lunch with fear and trepidation. I'm going to be sitting next to this giant of an intellect. And I remember her saying afterwards how she virtually almost just talked most of the time herself because of the way his gentleness and drew her out. And she loved the man from that moment on. And I think that probably helped her not be worried about me anymore. After she met an actually highly intelligent person, then she realized she could put me then in proper perspective. And so I think that probably helped our marriage. I forgot to tell Henry before he died, thanks for helping me with that as well. So Henry, wherever you are, thank you. Great man.
Charlie, there's a story you tell also about Henry, I think, right before he died, about something he said about feeling like he had figured it out, or he was right. Can you talk about that bit?
Well, in the final months of his life, the chief of psychiatry that I had worked under when I was in Des Moines, because I'd moved on to Georgia from that time, but Dr. Fitz, which I've always said was such an appropriate name for a psychiatrist, Fitz, but it was spelled F-I-T-Z, not S. But Fitzy, as I called him, would go over every other week and spend time with Henry, even though he was going down in energy levels. He was suffering from advanced stages of Parkinson's disease, but his mind was still crystal clear. There was no loss of memory or that sort of thing. And he was in the same week that he died, and Laura actually shared that story with Dr. Fitz. Laura was his wife. That one day Henry had just said, I know I'm right. I know this is true. And he had a peace about it, but also a confidence about it. It was like saying that this idea that I've pursued since 1917, now it's 1975, has, in a sense, never let me down. It has always allowed me to keep on growing, keep on learning, keep on being, you know, aware of what was going on in the world and so on. And, you know, for not to make a direct comparison, but I remember saying to my wife not all that many months ago, I think I know I'm right. And it was sort of from the same reason. And there's no way to prove you're right. But there's a quietness, a contentedness that said, I really don't have to look for another way of living my life. I can enjoy living it the way this process allows you to live. So I guess I got hooked on it in the same way.